So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the history of the universe. And the reason I think it's important to do this is so that you're able to see just how relatively little you matter. Maybe not quite in those terms, but if we take a look up here, and if we took the entire timeline of the universe from start to current, and we put it on a 12-month scale, this is what it's going to look like. And we don't have the sun appearing until roughly the last quarter or so. Earth doesn't really appear and form and become solidified until about the last 3 months. Pretty insignificant. Now, 4.5 billion years, formation of Earth. You want to know where we are? We are way down here, last 10 minutes of the last day of December. Humans have not been around that often, so let's start looking at where in this timeline all of the different events are. Okay. Neat. This is from Cosmos, I think it's called. There it is. The one with Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, really cool little clip if you're so inclined to watch. Also, FYI, I'm going to have a video on Schoology if you do want to watch this entire clip. Okay, so 4.5 billion years ago, Earth forms. It takes almost 1 billion years for the first life to even start showing up. And what this first life would have been is really just some DNA separated out from the environment with a membrane. In other words, a cell, kind of, but not at all like what you would expect it to look like nowadays. It takes another 1 billion years for the membranes to start coalescing and forming this complex system that makes eukaryotes what they are. For you to get a nucleus, for you to get the endoplasmic reticulum, for all that cool stuff. And even that, we're still just individual cells. You couldn't see them, super microscopic. You couldn't see them because you weren't alive then, and because they're microscopic. And then it takes another 500 million to 1.5 billion years before those cells start grouping together to form the first multicellular organism. So what should you pull out of this? Well, the first life, kind of prokaryotic. Then you increase complexity to have more eukaryotic type organisms. And then finally, multicellularity came along later. Now, that's not to say that all life became multicellular. If the tree of life is being shown here, and down at the bottom we've got just that very first life, the bacteria would have evolved from that, and sure, they're still around. We still have bacteria, we know that, those prokaryotic cells. So they have gotten more complex. They just haven't evolved to become eukaryotic because they're doing just fine without it. These are all showing you eukaryotic groups. There's only 3 branches on that whole tree that are multicellular. So all the animals, all the plants, all the fungi are just existing on 3 little branches of the tree of life. And so we refer to this last universal common ancestor, the last time that all of us came from a single organism, as LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, and that cell had the 8 characteristics that allowed it to become our common ancestor. Because it exists, you exist, and because it had the traits that allowed it to survive and thrive, you exist. Make sense so far? So let's start going over what those characteristics are. 80s reference? No? Moving on. So we know that life is animals, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, but why are those things, what makes them categorically different than viruses, than rocks, minerals, computers, motors? Do any of those things on the right respond to stimuli? Can I put an input into a computer and have it respond to what I've done?
Yes.
Do any of these things use matter and energy? I put fuel in my car, it does the go-go thing. Do any of those things grow? Sure. I could take amethyst, give it a few thousand years, and it will have grown. It will have added to it. And viruses, oof, they're really blurring the line right now. So what distinguishes those things on the left from those things on the right? 8 things. 8 simple rules to dating my daughter. Is that a TV show? I think I messed up the title. So, are you calling me old? Okay, move on. I'm used to it. So, we're looking at characteristics of living things. I said this is going to be your ticket out, so make sure that number 1, you memorize them. Number 2, you have an understanding for what they are. And we start with this. We start with Luca, the last universal common ancestor, as I said, had 2 things. It's DNA wrapped in a membrane. That DNA is going to be every informational piece to code for that organism, and it can be passed on. So that first life has this really cool molecule that's kind of different than most other molecules that we'll talk about. A little bit of DNA gets wrapped up in a membrane so that there is an inside and outside, an organism itself and its environment, and they are separate. In other words, first 2 characteristics of living things that we're going to look at. They always have DNA as their genetic material, and all living things are made of cells. 2 down, 6 to go. So far, so good? Okay. So when it comes to being a living thing, it's not enough to have DNA and a membrane. You have to have yourself, the stuff in that cell, be different than what's in the environment. So let's take a second. Okay. So the fact that we, inside each of our cells, is different than what's in the environment is an important characteristic of living things, and the ability to keep that consistent is one of our characteristics. So homeostasis is the ability to keep conditions relatively stable. Your internal conditions stay stable even if the outside environment changes. So 72 degrees in here, but here I am, 98 degrees. And I walk outside to where it's 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And so what happens? Does my body automatically just drop down to that temperature? No, stays at 98 degrees. Why? I walk outside and what happens? What do you notice physically about somebody that is in 38 degree weather with a t-shirt? Okay. Rocking some awesome goosebumps, shivering, pulling my body in nice and tight so that I'm not losing heat. So in order for organisms to maintain homeostasis, they have to be able to sense and respond to changes in their environment. A change in the environment is called a stimulus. So all living things must be able to respond to those stimuli. Stimulus 1, stimuli many. Okay. So we've got DNA wrapped up in membrane to make a cell. The inside of that cell keeps pretty stable conditions. That's called homeostasis. Why is it doing that? Well, because of its ability to respond to stimulus. What do you think that takes? What do I need a plethora of to be able to keep responding to stimuli? Energy and matter. I have to have a constant source of matter and energy. And together, that makes up all the chemical reactions in your body, your metabolism. Okay? So we've got these properties of living things. If I just look at them, for them to exist, DNA wrapped in a membrane. So DNA cells, they have to be able to maintain homeostasis. To do that, they have to respond to their stimuli. And to do that takes matter and energy, ergo metabolism. Different on the side. So when it comes to living things, they need to be able to first exist, have DNA, have cells. They need to be able to survive, maintain homeostasis, respond to stimuli, and have a metabolism. But it's not just about surviving, because if our last universal ancestor had merely survived a while and then died, well, y'all wouldn't be here, right? It's not just about living, it's about thriving. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 more characteristics. if you are able to thrive, if you are able as an organism or as an individual cell to do all of those other things, to maintain homeostasis and respond to stimuli and have a metabolism, and then you thrive, you can grow. For one cell, that means getting bigger. For a multicellular organism, that means making more cells. The difference between an elephant and a mouse is not the size of their cells, but how many they have. To develop. What is development? Change over a lifetime. It is why, even though you started out with an eye socket that essentially made up 90% of your face and a head that made up roughly 90% of your body and no limbs, you were the cutest little embryos. You've changed a little, some of you. Some of you still have some weird proportions, but you've changed over time. Over the course of your lifetime, you went from looking like this weird little embryo to now a weird little adolescent. That is development. So if you are thriving, you can grow, develop, and if you do really well, what might you be able to do? When you're old enough, don't think about it yet. Reproduce. So living things grow and develop.
Yeah.
Then they reproduce. Kicking it back to your quizzy. 2 types of reproduction that you should be familiar with. What are they? Asexual and sexual. Which one is going to cause the least amount of genetic diversity? Asexual. Not very interesting. So the development or the origination of sex in organisms really allowed for species to change a lot faster. We'll learn about why later. Okay? So if you're thriving, you can grow, develop, and you can reproduce. And what's really cool about reproduction is that every generation, gentlemen, every generation is going to have a few changes here and there between one generation and the next, and a few more changes here and there. And those that do the best at reproducing and pass on the most of their genes and do the best in their environments, those ones are able to survive. You develop, but you do not evolve. Populations or species do. So when you have these small changes between one generation and the next and the next and the next, eventually the species as a whole will change. Okay?